congratulations. This is Series G. What are the details? And this seems meaningful for Anduril.
It is. As we continue working on building a company that has the capacity to scale into the largest problems for the national security community, we thought it was really important to shore up the balance sheet and make sure that we have the ability to deploy capital into these manufacturing and production problem sets that we're working on. The round ended up being a $2.5 billion round at a valuation of $30.5 billion post-money. It's a tremendous opportunity for us to continue growing the team, growing the infrastructure, and our ability to really ramp up into these bigger problem sets.
Founders Fund led the round. You have an interesting role as executive chair at Anduril, but you recuse yourself from the Founders Fund part of that. They, I believe, wrote like one of, if not their biggest check ever.
Yeah, the largest check in Founders Fund history. We put $1 billion into the $2.5 billion round.
Okay. Why is this commitment, this necessary money right here, right now? Is this going to be the last one before a potential IPO?
Oh, man, it's a great question. There are a lot of ways to raise capital. It's not just the possibility of IPO. Obviously, long term, we continue to believe that Anduril is the shape of a publicly traded company. We're not in any, rapid path to doing that. We're certainly, going through the processes that are required to prepare for doing something like that in, the medium term. But right now, we're just very focused on the mission at hand, going at this as hard as we can. Does that mean we raise another private round of capital at some point? Maybe. Hard to say. We're always surprised at how much demand there is in these massively oversubscribed rounds.
How oversubscribed, please?
It was a lot, like 8 to 10x of what we had the capacity to take on. There's a lot of players that are starting to figure out that the momentum is drawing into, being able to do this at Anduril. And I think there's just a lot of interest from growth funds, from crossover funds, from mutual funds for getting a bite of that before there's a public market opportunity.
Well, interesting. You say getting a bite of the action when it comes more broadly to defense. Suddenly, all of Silicon Valley kind of wants to be in defense and in U.S. manufacturing. In fact, Andrew Bosworth of Meta yesterday talking about how maybe there's some bigger patriotism than we realized across Silicon Valley. Just take a listen.
There's a much stronger patriotic underpinning than I think people give Silicon Valley credit for. But taking a step deeper, this is actually a return to grace for the Valley potentially, not just from Meta, but from Google and other companies. The Valley was founded on a three-way investment between the military, academics, and private industry. That was the founding of it. There would be no technology if we weren't all tasked with the problem of computing naval ballistic trajectories during the first two world wars.
You have a partnership. The technology that Meta makes, working hand in hand with Anduril. Interesting, of course, that Palmer Luckey now goes back to a company that he, of course, sold Oculus to in many ways with this partnership. What does it look like? Are more partnerships going to be erupting here?
Well, I mean, to Boz's point, the world has changed a lot in the last 8 years. Anduril actually turns 8 years old tomorrow. We're approaching our anniversary, which is the anniversary of D-Day as well. We started the company on the 73rd anniversary of D-Day, recognizing there's an important contribution for not only ourselves, but also the American enterprise into national security efforts. Palmer was fired by Meta in 2016 for his politics. There was a Google Maven walkouts and protests. The reality is that the silent majority actually believes that these things are really, really important to work on. And, Palmer being able to go back to his roots and reach a point of forgiveness with the Meta team to focus on the most important task at hand, which is leaning in on the best-in-class optics and VR, AR work that they're doing to contribute to the mission that we're leading with the IVAS opportunity with the DoD.
What was really interesting about how Boz explained it is that they are basically providing components. We actually had Delian Asparov on the show the other day in the context of Founders and EnduroSat, and what he was talking about is that the innovation of big tech is being driven by consumer electronics, right? Thinking about your supply chain. Could you just explain the mechanics of how Meta works with you and why it's useful to you for them to come up with these components in the products that you want to do?
Right. I mean, they've done an incredible amount for the AR, VR community. I think Palmer has been on record many times saying that Zuckerberg is VR boy #1. He's led the way with putting a ton of capital into solving some of these basic science and research problems around optics, the physics challenges that make this really difficult. We don't have to take all of that on ourselves. We can go and partner with someone in America who believes in the mission, who's done a lot of that work, and then we can bring that into an integrated system, which is really what we do as a defense products company.
Let's talk politics. You talked about Palmer's politics. The story today is about President Trump speaking with China's Xi Jinping, and at the heart of that is rare earths. But I actually think for you guys, you've historically, when we've discussed China, taken a different approach, which is you believe Anduril is critically important now because of future hostilities from China. Just explain that thesis.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a huge supply chain component to all of this. China is right in the middle of most of these conversations around manufacturing, production, supply chain challenges with natural resources, including rare earth metals. At Anduril, we've been thinking about this long before the second Trump administration started. We've been shoring up to make sure that our tier 1 suppliers are being sourced from allied nations, the U.S. and our allied nations. For the first time ever, I think that the entirety of the government is taking supply chain seriously as a national security asset rather than just something that's kind of like important from a trade context. So I think it's incredibly critical that we don't wait until we have our access to critical materials, our access to chips, our access to all of these things removed from us.
But
we need to solve
already
for that
happening?
now.
Isn't there a limitation already on rare earths, and how does that impact your business?
There is, and this is the type of thing that you have to plan for well ahead of time, believing that at some point, we might lose access. And I think all, intelligent and thoughtful American companies need to be thinking about how to address that problem before it actually becomes a really critical existential threat.
Well, has the administration been doing it in a methodical manner that you wanted to see? Because at times there's been a worry about basically the timeframes that we get cut off too quickly before the US has really understood its own supply chain and resources. Many companies haven't been looking at this as well as Anduril has.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, at Anduril, certainly we've been thinking about it a lot. And through the Founders Fund context, I spend most of my day thinking about this exact problem. Xi has said very clearly that he intends to, reclaim Taiwan by 2027. That's a really short timeline. That doesn't mean that we have 5 or 10 years to build up semiconductor manufacturing capabilities. It means that we have like 2 years, 18 months. And so, we really need to be thinking about these things. I think it's incumbent upon the U.S. tech community to contribute in ways. It's incumbent upon the U.S. venture community to put capital towards solving some of these problems. And certainly every company needs to have a plan for how they're going to address that should it become a real issue.
Golden Dome.
Golden Dome, yes. Obviously there's very few things as exciting as the idea of protecting the U.S. homeland from airborne threats. We've been engaged in a lot of conversations there. Too soon to comment on anything.
That's my understanding, though. So when this big announcement happened at the White House, there were some of the sort of legacy prime defense contractors named, Lockheed Martin being one. And a lot of people that I speak to were surprised that the name Anduril wasn't said over and over again because of the position you now have as a supplier to the U.S. military apparatus. But it is early in this process. I guess the point is, what will happen? Do you have to make pitches and competitive bids and say, here's what we can offer in this? Or is it a case of the administration coming to you and say, do this for us?
Well, it'll obviously have to be a tremendously multi-layered approach. There's not going to be a single vendor that provides the entirety of the system. There's end effectors, interceptors, things like that, space-based interceptors, all the sensor networks that are going to be required, and then a software layer to coordinate and see to all of that activity that's going on. It's not just going to be Anduril. It's not just going to be Lockheed Martin. I believe that it will likely be a mosaic of a lot of different companies coming together to make sure that this problem is solved in the best way possible.
You talk about space. There is one particular founder who was very close to the White House who now seems to be less close, and it's Elon Musk. How are you seeing the relationship of venture with the administration right now? And Is there a repercussion as Elon withdraws and then seemingly gets pretty angry at the state of the current spending bill, or at least the way he sees it as a spending bill? They say it's reconciliation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're still very kind of near in on the start of the administration. We're only, 5 months into things right now. I do think that this administration is incredibly communicative with the tech community, with the venture community. The channels are open. They're curious. They're looking for information.
Do you have a direct line with President Trump at all?
There's lots of paths into the White House without commenting any further on that. But yeah, I think that there's a tremendous openness to having that dialogue. A lot of these initiatives, whether you're talking about the big beautiful bill, I like what Elon said. It's difficult for a bill to be both big and beautiful. It can be big or it can be beautiful. It can't be both. But I think there's at least receptivity, and we'll see how some of these big programs, these big plans shape over the next year.
And the reason Karo's question is important is, you were part of the contingent that went to the Gulf or the Middle East with the president and corporate America. Let's end here with a look at the future. After you and I were together in Ohio in January, my phone just kept ringing from private companies and startups that are in the defense technology space. Is there a world where Anduril and 3 or 4 other players exist and coexist, or is it just Anduril and nothing else?
Well, first off, I want to say thanks for coming to the Arsenal launch in Ohio.
It was freezing cold. Thank you for having me.
Cold. You're one of the few people ex-Anduril who has even seen the site in Ohio, so it was cool to have you out. Thanks so much for doing that. I think categories are tough, right? Like, there usually isn't such a thing as category investing. If you're a social media investor and you didn't invest in Facebook, you probably lost money. If you're a space investor and you didn't invest in SpaceX, you probably lost money. Do I think that there's room for a couple of players to make a big entry into the defense space? Sure. I don't think there's going to be multiple Andurils. And that's really our goal, is we're trying to create a concentrated opportunity to be a next-generation defense products company that goes out and wins these major programs where we're going to have the ability to bring software chops, autonomy, speed, scale, manufacturing into the defense industry for the first time as a new player in a really long time.